Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. My name is Hazel Bateman. I'm President of the International Pension Research Association, and we're the group hosting the webinar today. I'm in Australia, and before we commence meetings, we recognise the traditional owners of the land on which we are. So before we begin proceedings today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. Okay, so it's my great pleasure today to welcome our speaker, Susann Rohwedder. Susann is a senior economist at the RAND Corporation and Associate Director of the RAND Centre for the Study of Ageing. Susann's going to talk to us about explanations for the decline in spending at older ages. So I'm going to hand over to Susann, and I'd like to ask you to share your slides with us.
Thank you, Hazel, for the kind introduction. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to share this research in this forum, research on the declines in spending at older ages and what may be explanations for the declines that we see. This is joint work with my RAND colleagues, Michael Hurd and Peter Hudemith, and we're grateful to our funders, the Social Security Administration via the Michigan Retirement Research Center. However, anything that we present here, conclusions, findings, etc., are all our own and do not represent those of SSA or any federal government. All right, so why do we care? Why are we interested in how spending evolves at older ages and that whether it declines or what? Well, the context is helping every one of us really to better understand how to prepare financially for retirement. And for that, we need to anticipate what our spending needs in retirement are and how they evolve. This is not an easy task, and kind of common advice that has been out there is to take as a starting point the income replacement rate. It says that to finance spending in retirement, if you make sure that you have maybe say 80% of pre-retirement income, 70% for other households, maybe 90 depending on your household structure, etc., then you should be fine. This implicitly assumes that spending would be flat after retirement. However, there are a lot of changes to household circumstances over time throughout retirement. And so it's not clear whether that is a good approximation. But a detailed discussion of that is for another day. Another starting point may be, let's look at actual observed paths of how spending evolves in panel data. And admittedly, there are not a lot of good data sets out there to do this, but we have one, and that's the Health and Retirement Study. And let me show you what we find there. Importantly, we're looking at total spending, and we're looking at it longitudinally, looking at change in spending of the same household as we follow them over time from one wave to the next and stringing it together. What do we get? We clearly see that spending, real spending, it's adjusted for inflation here, declines, and we're starting out at age 65. And then we have computed rates of change in spending, 2-year rates of spending for each time for a 2-year wave of the same household. So it's really longitudinal, and then trace out these rates of spending. And whether you look at single households at the top or the households of married persons at the bottom, clearly spending declines. Somewhat steeper among married households, but they don't stay married forever. Unfortunately, there is widowing happening at some point as people then switch over to the path of single households. And there are some differences by, say, education, which is a good proxy for socioeconomic status, but the differences are not that large. Note this is spending change, not that great differences in spending change. The levels of spending, of course, would be very different by socioeconomic status. So with the fact established, spending declines, the big question, of course, is what do we make of it? If these spending declines are consistent with people's preferences, with their choices, say the result of intertemporal optimization in the utility maximizing framework, then this would be a good guide. However, if people have to start cutting spending as they advance in retirement because they're running out of wealth, maybe they were somewhat short-sighted, didn't set enough aside, then these declines in spending would actually be worrisome. they're a result of undersaving. And the question is, which interpretation is correct? And of course, we could have both types in the population. And this is what this study is about, to try to shed some light onto why spending declines, as we have shown here in panel. To fix ideas, I think it's helpful to resort to what different kind of models of economic theory would tell us, sort of a way of organizing our thinking. And let's start out with, say, a simple life cycle model where the only source of uncertainty is mortality risk. So people don't know how long their resources need to last. A good example of this kind of model is in a paper from the 60s in YARI. So because people don't know how long their resources need to last, they may unexpectedly die earlier than anticipated. And to the extent they haven't consumed all of their wealth, that wealth is wasted. They cannot use it anymore. So to guard against leaving wealth unused, kind of wasted in that context, people would, in this model, preload their consumption, consume a bit more earlier, and then make it to the next period. And if they are still alive, well, good, that's good, I guess, but unfortunately it means a new piece of information you're spending. Your resources have to last yet for another year longer. And so people can then, however, of course, not continue on this somewhat elevated spending path. And as they progress in retirement, then have to start reducing spending. And in this context, spending decline is chosen. It's a result of maximizing lifetime utility, subject to a lifetime budget constraint, but where there is uncertainty about length of life and so intertemporal optimization. So implication of a model like that, there's a decline, there will be declines in spending at older ages. It's not a sign of undersaving, but it's actually would be chosen as a result of intertemporal optimization. Now, at the other extreme would be a behavioral model where people are not forward-looking or have difficulties with that intertemporal optimization. So they don't set money aside or enough money aside for retirement. And then as they reach retirement, they're surprised at the low levels of resources and they need to make ends meet and start cutting their spending to live within their budget constraint. And in this context, the declining spending path would be sign of trouble. It would be evidence of undersaving. And motivated by some patterns we've observed in the data, we'll propose an extension of the YARI model. That is, that there may be other reasons why people may choose to reduce spending as they age, not just because of the implications of the force of mortality risk, but some other factors too. Because as I'll show you in a minute, it appears that for some categories of spending, there is complementarity between health and spending. So you enjoy the spending more while in good health. Traveling, it looks like, is more fun when you can share the experiences with someone, when you still have a partner, they're not yet widowed, or when you're still in good health, less so when in bad health. Or maybe other aspects as well. Let's say you get less enjoyment from some types of spending because, let's say, you don't have friends to share some activities with anymore, or you've done a lot of travel, you've seen a lot of places, maybe are not quite as eager to go on that next trip again. And let me share with you some of these patterns in spending budget shares that have motivated these conjectures. Here you see the budget shares, that is the fraction of total spending spent, for example, on transportation by age band, or on clothing, or on trips and vacation. And you notice a large fraction of spending goes towards transportation in people's 50s and 60s, more than 16% of their total budget, but it does decline and gets lower at older ages and is down to 12% at 85 plus. And then similarly, clothing, it's higher for those people in their 50s and lower for people in their late 80s. Trips and vacations, somewhat different pattern. Smaller fraction of total spending in people's 50s. Presumably some people are still busy with work and can't go and travel as much as they maybe would like to. They defer it until their early years of retirement, but then as health isn't so helpful anymore, the spending on trips and vacation declines. Now, a critic might say, all very well, but it could also be still result of a budget constraint. People cut spending on clothing or transportation or on trips and vacation because, well, they're starting to run out and they have to be more prudent with their resources. Well, to that, here's something that we found extremely interesting. Here are the budget shares for gifts and donations. And the age pattern is very different. Gifts and donations, you would think, if you're running out of resources, it's not something that you have to continue doing. It seems something that is more discretionary. And we see a very, very strong age pattern here with age increasing in age, where in people's 50s, people put about 4% towards gifts and donations of their total budget. And among people who are above age 80, it is 9 or a little over 9%. So that doesn't look like very much an activity that people would do, a type of spending they would do when financially constrained. And actually, we've looked at this also for different wealth groups, and it's not just concentrated among the wealthy. Also, the gifts and donations continue also at older ages among people in the lower SES groups. So from these observations, we were inspired to distinguish 3 categories of goods. There are those who that are substitutable for health. So what this would mean is you get more enjoyment from this type of spending, or more utility, I should maybe say, when your health is bad. So healthcare spending would be a prime example. There are those categories of spending that are neutral, completely independent on your health status or age. And this is gifts and donation. And then I should say health. Then there are the categories that are complementary with health. That is, you get more enjoyment, more utility out of this type of spending when health is good, such as trips and vacation, various leisure activities. And we'd like to even look at it somewhat more broadly. We suspect that various spending categories and how much people want to spend on them, how much enjoyment they get from them, is not just depend on health, but it may also depend on their household structure. Do they still have a spouse or partner to enjoy activities with? What about their friends? And also kind of declining utility from things that you've already done quite a few times in your life. So with that in mind, we would propose an extended YARI model. And in that model, then the agent knows that health declines with age. And I think most people would sympathize with that, with that foresight. And that this person would also understand that some types of spending will be less productive once health is bad and other things that set in with age. And that would lead a person to, again, preload some spending, have spend more on these things early in life, and then anticipate reducing that spending as they age. And so again, we will expect declining consumption path, even ex ante, chosen ex ante, not just due to the increasing mortality risk, but also through other factors as mentioned here. So, and again, this is kind of anticipated my next slide. So we have the implications, what we carry then away from this extended YARI model. And what we want to find is direct evidence that answers these questions. Are these reasonable conjectures? Can we find direct supportive evidence that there is such a thing as declining marginal utility of some types of spending as people age or as their health changes, etc. And here's then what we did to find out. We asked respondents. So in a survey of a representative sample of the US population, older population, I'll get into the details in a moment. We asked respondents, first of all, how their spending changed over the last 6 years, and if it changed, for the reasons for those changes. And I will show you what we found there. And then we'll also ask everybody, not just those who reported changes in spending, but everyone, whether related to a number of specific activities and spending categories, whether their enjoyment of that spending has changed. And then we'll go to the next step and see whether these changes in enjoyment actually predict changes in spending. And then we want to look at the problem from a completely different angle and see what that looks like. We'll look at whether there are signs of distress among older households, especially as people age, because if the reductions in spending are not chosen, are forced upon them in an unanticipated way, not the result of utility maximization, but of lack of forward looking and having to cut spending in unanticipated ways, then we would anticipate finding that there is greater degree of financial distress at older ages, and that it gets worse as people age. So we'll look at that too. And the data come from the health and retirement studies of our workforce, our premier data set of a whole range of studies of the older population over age 50. It's been going for a very long time, since 1992. But here we're using a sub-study, the Consumption and Activities Male Survey. It started a bit later in 2001 and is administered to a random sample of about 1/3 of the households in the health and retirement study. And it collects data on total spending, querying about spending in about 35 categories. And then once aggregating those up, analyzing them, and obtaining a total annual spending. And when comparing that to statistics from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, this seems to match up very well. But key difference to the Consumer Expenditure Survey is we have large samples at all ages, and we have longitudinal data. We are following the same households over time. And to this data set, we had the opportunity in the CAMS 2019 to add a few questions to produce direct evidence on these things we've been musing about. And here's how some of this goes. First of all, we ask about people's perception of how their spending has changed over the last 6 years. We ask, how has your household spending changed the past 6 years? Think about your typical spending, and so on and so forth. And then we follow up with questions about reasons. We supplied a few that seemed very obvious candidates that people could just check, but we also allowed open-ended responses. When coding those up, they actually fit quite nicely into most of the categories we had already offered them. And you'll not be surprised, one of the reasons will be also that we included there is the less enjoyment from some spending categories. And for reasons of increasing, we'd ask whether it was due to getting more enjoyment out of them. First of all, let's see how people answered. What are their perceived changes in spending over a 6-year period, and then how that matches up with their actual sort of more detailed reports of that spending that we get from the CAMS data itself, where it goes through the 35 categories, etc. So first of all, their perceived spending change in these categories, they could say it decreased a lot, a little, about the same, increased, and here you see the distribution in the population. 37% said their spending was about the same. If you add up the both categories that indicate increase, then that's about 34% said their spending increased over the 6 years, and then some 28% said it decreased. Probably people answered this sort of thinking of nominal spending, and we didn't specify to keep the question wording a little bit simpler. But now in these kind of categories that people reported of their spending change, we then cross-checked with their sort of detailed spending reports in 2019 and compared it to their detailed spending reports from 2013 and calculated the difference, and then give you here by these buckets of perceived spending change, the median change that you would get from this different approach of calculating it. And you see very nice lineup. Those who said that their spending decreased a lot, also in this more directly measured way of getting at their total spending, indeed had the largest spend in declines, and it all lines up very beautifully. We check that especially because it is a good indication of how engaged people are in our surveys and whether they're giving us consistent answers and about the data quality. And then we followed up here, for example, for people who said they had a reduction in spending, why that was, what were the reasons for that? And I'm showing here some of the most important ones. And I'm showing that the different colored bars represent the different age bands. And given our interest in mind of declines in spending with increasing age, do we see some age patterns here? First of all, on the left here, you see the fraction of persons who say they reduce spending because they just cannot afford to spend as much. And it's quite a large fraction. Conditional on reporting a reduction, that has to be kept in mind, which was some 28% of the population. Among them, some 45% say that they cannot afford to spend as much as 6 years ago, but we do not see an age pattern. So this is as much kind of a reality of life, if you will, among people in their 50s as it is among people in their 80s. And admittedly, budget constraints are actually not something that's particularly unique to retirement. Also, young families are living with budget constraints and cannot always spend as much as they would like. So no age pattern here. That is quite interesting. Then number of people said that their spending was lower because they have fewer people in the household. And the age pattern here makes sense. In their 50s, probably there's still some kids leaving the household. And then fewer people mention that as a reason, but then it becomes more important again at older ages, and that's presumably where more widowing occurs. But now let's look here on the right. Enjoyment, less enjoyment from some items. This has a very strong age pattern. People in their 80s, many more people say that they reduce spending because they get less enjoyment from some categories. Now, this is just reported among people who reduce spending. But of course, getting less enjoyment from some spending categories could be happening also even if you had increases in spending, but there would just be different types of, there's just different composition of spending. So it was very important, and luckily we had the foresight of doing this to make sure that we ask everyone about their change in enjoyment from various spending related activities. So there was a whole block of questions where it said, compared to 6 years ago, how much enjoyment do you, or if you don't spend, would you get today from, say, going out to eat? So we had different fields here, and people could answer on a 5-point scale, much less, a little less, about the same, etc. And we asked about the following categories: going out to eat, traveling, leisure activities, having new clothes, new car, new appliances, giving financial support to family and friends. I'll show you what we find. And on the next slide, to make it a little bit more digestible, we compacted the 5-point scale to a 3-point scale where we have less enjoyment, same, or more. Here it is. So just showing it first for the first 4 categories, the percent saying either that they get less enjoyment. So this is always compared to this within person comparison compared to 6 years ago. And anything that is less enjoyment gets an orange color. Everything that indicates more enjoyment compared to 6 years ago gets a blue color, and gray is same. And you'll notice the gray ones are somewhat stable with age, so we conveniently get to focus just on sort of orange and blue. And you will notice that for a number of these categories, we see a distinct age pattern of increasing orange. That is, people get less, people at older ages are more likely to report that they get less enjoyment, say, from traveling. That is a sort of really very stark pattern here, where people in their 80s, some 60% say they get less enjoyment, people 85 plus, almost 80% say they get less enjoyment from traveling. And then, while not quite as high, you still see very high percentages and these age patterns for other things, say leisure activities, having new clothes and eating out. Again, higher fraction saying, excuse me, that they get less enjoyment from this type of spending. And then here are the other categories that we had: having a new car, new appliances, financial support. And again, we see these patterns of less enjoyment from spending and dedicating resources to these activities. So to sum up across all of them, so at 75 plus, spending seems to produce less utility compared to 6 years ago. And this was across the 7 categories. We can compact it a little bit further, say for everyone, take the average score of enjoyment across all the categories we asked about, and then take the average by these age bands, and you get this kind of summary score of change in enjoyment compared to 6 years ago. First thing to note, for everyone, for across all age bands, we see scores that are less than 3. 3 is no change, less than 3 means less enjoyment. But the less enjoyment, and how much less enjoyment compared to 6 years ago, is actually greater at these older ages. And so that supplies some of the direct evidence and direct support we were looking for in terms of our hypothesis that we formulated at the outset, less enjoyment from some spending activities. And you may, however, say, hold on a minute, I may actually get less enjoyment from spending on certain items when I'm worried about finances. If I'm going to a restaurant and I'm really worried about what that bill is going to look like, I'm not going to enjoy going to a restaurant, and therefore I won't do it. All right, so one thing that we then did is we constructed regression adjusted enjoyment scores where we regressed them on health and also financial constraints now and the change in financial constraint and some demographic indicators, etc., to try to kind of abstract or filter those effects out. And this is what you get here. We still get a very strong age profile in these enjoyment scores. So it's not just driven by financial constraints. Now, key question, if enjoyment from some categories declines, does it, however, predict changes in spending and spending composition? And particularly, this is what we'll look at here. That is the key question we are after. So if we are looking at analyzing budget shares in this particular category, we also have to control for the level of spending, because how much a household spends on a particular category, of course, depends also on their total spending. You can see how, say, luxury goods would make up a smaller fraction of total spending of high wealth households compared to low wealth households. Anyways, and so if we want to then analyze changes in budget shares, then it's very important to then also control for the change in total spending, which we do here, various demographics. And then we also add these variables that measure the changes in enjoyment in the different categories that we queried people about. And we find that they are strongly statistically significant in our regressions. And here are the coefficients that we get. And we find the expected positive association. So for whatever that means, but for a unit of increase in enjoyment, say enjoyment of traveling, people who have a reported increase in enjoyment of traveling, they will increase in panel their spending that goes towards traveling, or vice versa. If they have a decrease in enjoyment, then they'll reduce the fraction spent on traveling. And you may think, so here, for example, the coefficient indicates something of 0.5 percentage points. This is on the basis of a budget share of about 3 to 5%. So it is meaningful. It is maybe not huge. Of course, there's some issues of merit error, but again, strongly significant and somewhat meaningful orders of magnitude. Next, this is now the kind of change of gears. Now we want to look at the sign. Are there any signs of increasing financial distress at older ages? If these declines in spending are not anticipated and not what people plan for, we should see increases with age in financial distress. So in that CAMP survey, we included a number of questions on this issue as well. On people's current situation, for example, how satisfied are you with your present financial situation? And 5 answer categories, from completely satisfied to not at all satisfied, or to what extent is your household constrained in its spending, very constrained somewhat, etc. And we'll compact these again a little bit so we can show you these pictures a little bit more nicely. It's 3-point scale. And here again shown by age band. What you see, orange again is something quote unquote bad, so people who are not satisfied, and blue is people who are completely satisfied. Gray is the same. Gray conveniently kind of stays nicely, fairly solid here and constant, so we can focus on the colored ones again. And we see at older ages, there seems to be less, so more satisfaction, less dissatisfaction at older ages compared to younger ages. And also same thing for financial constraints. However, that reflects, of course, a cross-sectional relationship. A few things could be wrong with it. Cohort differences, differential survival. So we did include some other questions where we asked people how their financial situation compares to 6 years ago. Are they more satisfied, a little more satisfied, about the same, or less satisfied? And same thing for financial constraints. Are you more constrained or less constrained now, but the same? So this is a within person comparison, so it doesn't suffer from these issues I just mentioned. And here, for once, we actually will also look at the gray bar, not bar, the gray trajectory here, a line which shows the fraction where things have stayed the same. And we see increasing stability, a much larger fraction at older ages that say it's about the same at older ages than younger ages. And in terms of orange, which is again sort of the bad, things have gotten worse. People are less satisfied or they are more financially constrained. So we don't see that that is higher at older ages and within person comparison than at younger ages. So overall, 50%, for example, if we would zero in, say at 80 plus, 50% report satisfaction of about the same as 6 years ago, 25% report better, but 25% say it's worse. So, and then again, down here, focusing on 80 plus, 40% say unchanged, 40% say increased financial constraints, 20% say decreased. But again, that fraction is not higher than say the ones who are expressing concern that is increase in financial constraint, is not any higher at these ages than at younger ages. And that brings me roughly to the time where it's time to put it all together and conclude. First of all, real spending declines with age if you look at total spending and if you look in panel data. Apparently, not everybody agrees with that fact, but we have in these data estimated in also many ways, and this finding is very robust. But of course, the important question is, what explains this change in spending? Is it cause for concern, or is it something that is consistent with consumer preferences? And we did note that according to the budgeters we looked at, that there seemed to be complementarities between health or aging as people move through retirement. But to move from conjecture, we wanted to find direct evidence. And so we asked people directly about changes in enjoyment from various types of spending and spending related activities. And did confirm that people say they get less enjoyment from a number of things. So that would suggest that in these various categories, people don't need to spend as much as they get older, which frees up spending on other things, say healthcare spending. When we looked at the issue of whether these declining spending paths are sign of concern, we looked at it from another angle also, whether we see loss of economic dissatisfaction or financial distress. However, when we look at age patterns and economic satisfaction, both in cross-section and also kind of within person comparison over 6 years, first of all, we see that satisfaction is higher at older ages. There's more stability at older ages. Many people say no change. And also the budget constraints don't seem to worsen with age, or at least not any differently at old age than early ages. So what does that then mean? I think it's useful to circle back to what that means for economic models, because obviously if we want to have helpful and useful models to help in economic analysis of consumer behavior, they need to reflect well consumers' preferences and consumers' behavior. And if we think of the extended YARI model versus then that behavioral model we presented at the outset, both would predict that people experience financial constraints and more so at older ages. But economic satisfaction presumably would be flat in the YARI model, because people anticipated that this was, they knew that if they survive longer, at some point they will have to cut back the spending. And plus then some of these extended, these factors that we mentioned of the extended YARI model, where they also get less enjoyment from some of the spending, then again, economic satisfaction would presumably not change. The behavioral model would be very different. You would expect declines in economic satisfaction with age. However, that's not really what we found. Now, be really neat if we also had some data where we could directly measure what people expect their spending to be and also what they would like their spending to be, what is consistent with their preferences. I guess some more work to do there, stay tuned. But then just a couple more words on how this, what we then take away from this for assessing economic preparation for retirement, or what should we tell people and how we can help them to think about how much they need in retirement. Should we tell them to turn, or should we use the flat spending path as implied by the income replacement rate? We could also otherwise turn to the structural economic models using dynamic programming, not that accessible for the average person. Some of us can do it. Or should we use as a starting point the empirically observed spending paths that we have found that are declining, and reassure ourselves to what extent they are consistent with people's preferences and, if you will, not too harmful. I would argue that we have provided some strong evidence that they are not too harmful. There are no strong signs of financial distress at these older ages, and with some of these other factors that suggest that people actually do not enjoy to spend as much on certain things as they age, they also seem to be consistent with their preferences. Still, don't want to gloss over the fact that there were some who also had some worsening economic situation. And two things to say about that. Number one, yes, we need to pay attention to that, but it also means that for the population at large, we do not really need to encourage everyone to save more. It seems for a large number of people, it seems to be things are working out fine. But there are some spots of concern. The question is, were they due to undersaving early in life or experience of shocks, which then would be more a cause for social policy? That would be another then research question. And with that, I will conclude.